Well, welcome in, Tiger fans, fresh off the bye week, and we've got a dandy this upcoming weekend as LSU plays Ole Miss at home. I got Tyler Komis here with the Ole Miss 247 side alongside me for a little behind enemy lines preview of this game. Tyler, you and I were just talking. The weather is going to be phenomenal in Baton Rouge. We cross our fingers. This is a game that has all the amped up energy of what happened last year. Obviously, in Oxford, a lot of, I don't want to say bad blood, but there's a revenge factor for some LSU players that were in that game. Tyler, this is going to be a fun one. So, welcome to the show. And kind of just start us off. How excited are you and maybe the Ole Miss fans for an opportunity for what looks like to be a top 15 matchup on Saturday night?
Yeah, first of all, Bryce, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you giving me the time. And yeah, Ole Miss fans are stoked about this game. You know, their playoff chances were on life support going into week 6 and going into South Carolina after an upset loss that nobody really anybody saw coming, especially at home for Ole Miss against Kentucky. But they were able to bounce back in week 6 with a convincing road win against South Carolina. 27-3, and I expect Ole Miss fans to travel really well down to Baton Rouge for this game. Obviously, not outnumbering, the LSU faithful, but they're stoked. The season's back, and this is pretty much a playoff game in the eyes of Ole Miss fans, I think.
Yeah, it's not just a playoff game to get to the playoff, but this maybe feels like an elimination to get to Atlanta. And I know, let's start right there. I had said multiple times, if this is the year Ole Miss was going to make the trip to the SEC title game, this felt like a make or break year for Lane Kiffin, all the talent that this roster had. Kind of tell me, and I know you mentioned a little bit there, what's kind of the temperature or the mood of the fan base? I know just a frustrating loss to Kentucky at home, but you go on the road, Tyler, where I know your counterpart Jared Redding was there. I went a couple weeks ago and LSU was at South Carolina. That's a hard place to play, and that's a pretty solid South Carolina team. What's the mood of the fan base, maybe with the preseason expectations and just coming into this ball game?
Yeah, the mood is kind of like you said. It feels like an elimination game every week the rest of the way for Ole Miss with that early blemish to a Kentucky team. We don't know how it's going to shake out for them. They look like they're going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack, maybe in the SEC. But people are believing it again. The team had a really season defining point after that Kentucky loss, and Jackson Dart kind of took it upon himself to have a team meeting the day after. Said the team couldn't sleep, and they ended up bouncing back in a big way. So I think they're starting to believe again. And preseason, I think the biggest questions around this team was how they were actually, you got a good team on paper, but how is
Right.
that going to come together as a unit? And they had every opportunity to divide after last week's loss. And it seems like everything's back to normal for these guys, and they're just taking it one game at a time.
You mentioned that one game at a time approach. That's kind of what LSU has done since the loss to USC, just trying to build themselves back into the picture. And it feels like when you talk about the SEC right now, and maybe this is just the LSU perspective, LSU's kind of in that tier two, maybe tier three. Of we talk about the Georgias, the Alabamas, the Texas, the Ole Miss of the world, and it was kind of fun on our message board. LSU fans just kind of got to sit back and relax and watch chaos unfold last night. We're recording this on Sunday, but on Saturday it was chaos across the SEC.
Yeah.
So, Tyler, for both of these teams, it feels like a fairly wide open race to be one of the two teams in Atlanta at the end of the year. Would you kind of echo that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I think it's just LSU, Texas A&M, um, that are undefeated in conference
Mhm.
play. Ole Miss trying to stack more wins. Obviously, they got that one loss, but yeah, it feels like whoever loses this game is probably out of that race, given the rest of both teams' schedules. But definitely major implications as far as SEC championship goes this weekend.
Yeah, and I've maintained I think eventually we'll see a world where a three-loss SEC team gets in the playoff, but I don't think LSU or Ole Miss want to try that this season. I think they would obviously
No,
like to win this game on Saturday because both teams have big marquee games left on the schedule the rest of the way.
no
You
doubt.
know, you talk Tyler about Jackson Dart, and it's a guy that coming into the season, a lot of people gave a lot of love to Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, but Jackson Dart's a guy who's been doing this and improving every single year in Oxford. He elected to come back. You mentioned they're a de facto leader of this team. What does he give this offense, and how much better can it be as the season goes on, in your opinion?
Yeah, right now, honestly, I'd say this offense has a long way to go, in their eyes too. You know, they've kind of I think 17 points, against Kentucky, 27 yesterday. They felt like they left a lot of points on the table in both games, and that is true. But what I think Jackson Dart brings to this offense is, he's one of the best dual threat quarterbacks I think in the country. Right now, Ole Miss fans would probably like to see him slide a little bit more, especially as these SEC games keep stacking, because he just doesn't have that sliding mentality for better or worse. We'll see how that works out for him. But he's kind of struggling through the air a little bit these last 2 weeks. He'll tell you that too, overthrowing players, and you can't. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell with it if it's his decision making that's the issue at times, or it's the play calling. The other week he went to Trey Harris. I think he completed 11 of his 18 total completions to Harris,
Wow.
and that wasn't going to get the job done for Ole Miss. They have so much talent on the offensive side of the ball. I think he would probably agree that it's the most talent he's ever had in his career around him. I think they have his college football playoff skill set on offense, except the one thing kind of holding them back just a little bit, in my opinion, is that offensive line. It's a
Mm.
little beat up for sure, but I was impressed with how they kind of held their own against a really good South Carolina defensive line, I thought. Um, but yeah, this offense has honestly a long way to go to get to where they even want to be at.
And look, regardless, and I know LSU fans will have to swallow their pride when they hear this. Regardless of what you think, Lane Kiffin's a phenomenal offensive play caller. When you think of a guy that can get a lot out of a little, he's been that, and now he has a lot to work with. So you feel like, logically, Tyler, this offense will get better. That's kind of
Yes.
as the season goes on, they'll evolve into what Lane Kiffin wants this group to look like, and more. You mentioned Trey Harris. You mentioned the weapons. What are some of the other weapons that LSU fans may want to keep an eye on, and this defense for LSU may want to keep an eye on when they suit up on Saturday?
Yeah, definitely. I think a couple under the radar guys I would look out for if your LSU defense is Caden Prescorn. His usage hasn't been what it was towards the end of last season, but I mean, this guy's I still think one of the best tight ends when he's utilized that way. So I think he's always a guy to watch when you have attention on Trey Harris and Juice Wells, Jordan Watkins, names like that. And aside from those guys, another kind of under the radar guy that people probably don't know a whole lot about is sophomore Caden Lee. He's kind of emerged as a starter over the veteran Jordan Watkins, just because Watkins has been a little banged up. He looks closer to 100% now, but Lee, they kind of have some design plays for him. He's kind of a shorter receiver, but he can fly around the field for sure, and he can be a big play waiting to happen at any point. Um, but yeah, he can take screens, slants, things like that, bubble plays, and when he's utilized, he can be pretty dangerous too. So those are some guys I'd keep an eye on, and I know last year this has been a huge topic of discussion, by the way, over here. The underutilization of returning, I think he was the highest graded SEC running back coming back this year, Ulysses Bentley, the fourth. A lot of Ole
Yeah,
Miss fans wondering where he's at. I want to say he had a big game against LSU last year. I think he
yeah.
had one ripped off one touchdown run at least, and that was as a secondary guy behind Quinshawn Judkins. Now the primary guy is Henry Parrish Jr., followed up by former walk-on Matt Jones. Um, Obviously, the more carries go to Henry Parrish, but a lot of Ole Miss fans are wondering where Ulysses Bentley is. So I mean, at this point, he could pop up at any time in a moment's notice, or he might just not even show up for the rest of the year. But he's still on there. So those are some guys I would look out for if you're LSU.
I got you. And obviously, Ulysses Bentley, LSU fans have mentioned him already on the message board and saying, where is this guy? He left some bad taste in the mouths of LSU fans in that defense last year. Tyler, let's flip it over to the other side of the football here where, I've been impressed with the job. And I think that Alabama fans maybe got a little tired of Pete Golding, but, in Ole Miss, he's done a pretty good job, I think, in terms of correcting some wrongs that Lane Kiffin had early in his tenure over there in Oxford. It's a defensive line that looks really, really great on paper, Tyler. And how would you kind of grade their performance so far this season? And they're going to be going up against an offense that isn't prolific as it was last year, but it's been pretty dang good for LSU so far this season.
Yeah, right now, you said the defensive line grade.
Yeah, just how would you grade that defensive line just throughout the early portion of the season?
Man, I gotta give him an A, honestly, and,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm not an easy grader maybe, but, but no, I think, the additions of Princely Uman-Millen, Walter Nolan, they've been pretty much providing exactly what Ole Miss, was looking for when they added those 2 high-profile guys out of the portal. Uman-Millen, he actually missed last week's game against South Carolina due to, I wanna say, a foot injury, that he suffered against Kentucky. But Walter Nolan, 2 sacks yesterday. That was probably his best game as a Rebel. He looked really disruptive, and they're looking for consistency. That's the main thing out of him. And then you move along to JJ Pegues, Jared Ivey, 2 veteran returners for Ole Miss that have been here since 2022. And by the way, they were there for that 2022 game at LSU too, which is in the back of a lot of guys' minds, I'd say. But yeah, those 2 guys provide a ton of stability up front. Pegues is a little banged up with. They thought he broke his collarbone at first a couple weeks ago, but it was negative, and he's been a limited participant through practice ever since. But it's just kind of a pain tolerance for him at this point. And yeah, we expect him to go. And right now, honestly, the defensive line, defensive front has kind of been making up for a lot of the deficiencies we've seen out of the secondary so far. That's
Mm.
been kind of a weak point for Ole Miss. If you want to, I mean, their defense has been good. I think, allowed 3 points to South Carolina. It was their third game this year where they allowed 3 points or less. That's half their games. That's pretty good. And on paper, that looks great. But Ole Miss does have a lot of question marks in the secondary, and the defensive line is really helping them out too, just by getting back there as soon as possible and allowing them to cover less. And even more than that, a couple blown coverages here and there. The secondary has a bit of a tendency to get flagged a lot, and that's been a
Mm.
topic of discussion lately. A lot of holding, pass interference calls. So they got some things to make up, but that defensive line has been phenomenal. Is one of the main reasons why Ole Miss's defense can be considered among the SEC's best.
I wanted to pose this question to you, and I'm sure if you share this with the Ole Miss listeners, they'll be like, "Well, that guy's an LSU guy." And one thrown out there, they can grow up an LSU fan. I just worked the job, but
That's right.
I think it's a legitimate question when you look at the strength of schedule, so far, and that's probably been something that has been a question mark of just Ole Miss. Obviously, during the early portion, able to beat some teams that you were better than on paper. I mean, that's just what it was, and then I laugh. I came from the ACC, covering the ACC. You beat Wake Forest, and Wake Forest said, "We don't want to play you anymore. Like, we're done. We don't want to do that." But is there maybe a question that still needs to be answered for this Ole Miss defense when they face an offense that can be a little bit more balanced? I mean, I know Kentucky is not a team that could light you up. South Carolina is okay offensively. Is that a question mark? You feel like this defense still needs to check the box off and say, "Hey, when we play a offense that can, score points, if we can keep them in check, then it maybe gives us more confidence in what we can do."
Yeah, you're right. Honestly, I didn't even think about it, but yeah, I'd say the biggest question is what is this defense going to look like when you do have a balanced, proficient attack, through the air and ground? Because the first 2 SEC teams they've played are very run heavy, and that's
Mm.
played well for Ole Miss's defensive front. Um, but yeah, their secondary, I think, still has a ton of questions. I'm interested to see, when they're being forced to guess what the offense is doing, you never know. Instead of it
Mm.
being so predictable, I think that's a huge question, especially for that secondary. Because I mean, Nussmeier is easily the best quarterback that they've faced up to this point.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, and like I said, Ole Miss fans might roll their eyes, but I think it's a legitimate question. I mean, I like what
Yes.
Ole Miss has done this year, but I mean, obviously, the big test is when you can go face a team that can move the ball in different ways, and that's something LSU has seen a rise of, especially in the run game over the past couple of weeks. Last thing before we kind of get to that final topic that we were talking about earlier, any other defensive names outside of what's on the front seven that you maybe want to see step up, or that LSU should just keep an eye on that defensive side of the football?
Yeah, I think a couple guys I'd keep an eye on I know you said out of the front seven, kind of hard. But I will say one name, Trey Amos is probably their lockdown
Mm.
corner. He's got 2 interceptions so far. Transfer from Alabama, who really didn't get a whole lot of playing time like he is now with the Crimson Tide. So it was always going to be interesting to see how he was going to respond, getting taking that lockdown corner one spot at least for Ole Miss. But and two other names I'd say, maybe not off the defensive line, but linebackers, Chris Paul, for sure, Suntarine Perkins, and TJ Dottery. Dottery might be a name that kind of falls under the radar, but he's Ole Miss's main communicator. He's got the headset. So he's kind of the quarterback of the defense. And I'd look at Suntarine Perkins and Chris Paul. Paul transferring from Arkansas, so he's got a lot of SEC experience. That guy runs his pursuit is some of the best I've ever seen. Just running sideline to sideline, things like that. He's like a headhunter on the field, honestly.
Mm,
And then Perkins too. He can get after the quarterback, and he provides a lot of versatility. Being able to play linebacker and off the edge is where he's played the most. He's had three third down sacks in the last two SEC games, so he's made his presence felt, and he's only a sophomore. So they're really happy with those four guys. I'd say right now that might fly under the radar.
Well, for LSU fans, Trey Amos won't. They flirted with him in the transfer portal, and obviously a new Iberia guy just down the road, we'll say, from Baton Rouge. And so that's one guy that in the portal LSU thought they might be able to get, and Ole Miss snagged him up. But I think it's gonna be a fun matchup on Saturday. I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction. I don't want you to get in trouble with our subscribers or yours. But what I will say is we do in every single Behind Enemy Lines podcast. Ole Miss wins this game if. What are one or two or even three, if you want to go there, things that need to happen for Ole Miss to leave Death Valley with a win?
Oh man. First of all, offensive line for sure. I think that's the biggest question mark on this Ole Miss team. Yeah, they had a good serviceable performance against South Carolina, but they got to do it again against a front like LSU. That I don't know all the names off the top of my head, but I know they got the size and the power. So that's going to be a big challenge. And if that whole thing's disrupted up front, it's going to limit Ole Miss's play calling. Maybe even Jackson Dart's decision making if he doesn't have all that time. And protecting the football is definitely my next key. He Dart was I believe he turned over the football in their win last year against LSU in that shootout.
Mhm.
Um, but the year before, definitely turnovers were an issue for him, and that's what was holding Ole Miss back that his first year here. So his decision making and play calling, that's going to be huge. And then Ole Miss's secondary, not I'd say the two weakest points of this team, if you want to call it that, is their offensive line and their secondary. I'm very interested to see how Ole Miss matches up against, with so many skill sets that LSU has, like a Kyron Lacey, and players like that. The tight end, what's his name again?
Mason Taylor, yeah.
Yes, Mason Taylor, one of the best in the country. So that's going to be very interesting to see how they cover that. And if they can hold their own and let the defensive line kind of just do what they've been doing all year, they should be in good shape on both sides of the ball. Um, I could see. I'm not going to give you a score prediction, but I could see this game being a lot lower scoring than last year, just because Ole Miss has some things they still got to figure out on offense, and obviously LSU might not have a Heisman quarterback this year. So lower scoring game, I could see that for sure.
Yeah, no, Tyler, I agree with you, man. I think one, that game last year in Oxford was nuts. And if you're just a college football fan and you didn't have a dog in the fight, which I, obviously I didn't grow up an LSU fan. I was just kind of sitting there enjoying it as a media member. That was crazy. And then, but like you said, a lot of talent that LSU lost and some talent that Ole Miss lost as well. So it'll be interesting to watch on Saturday. And we appreciate Tyler's time. If you want all the latest and maybe more of the Ole Miss take, Tyler, tell people where they can find your work and your entire team's work if they want more of the Ole Miss perspective heading into this game.
Yeah, for you LSU fans that want to maybe keep up with Ole Miss a little bit more this week, I'd say the main source of news would be just going to rebs247.com on Inside the Rebels. Me, David Johnson, Jared Redding, gonna have a ton of Ole Miss, LSU content, those kind of things. And if you want to see a little bit more, maybe a little bit more of my opinion, you can follow me on Twitter at Tyler Komis. And that's where our coverage is mostly going to be leading up to the game. So we're looking forward to it. It's a big time SEC showdown. I'm excited to see how it turns out. Too bad we got to wait 6 more days for it.
I know 6 more days for the first true Saturday night in Death Valley. I know both fan bases are going to be excited. Tyler Comus of Inside the Rebels and our sister site over there in Oxford. We appreciate the time, man. Best of luck to you guys, but obviously maybe not this week. I think LSU fans will wish Ole Miss luck maybe the rest of the season, but not this one. This is the Go 24/7 podcast. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. We appreciate if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening this in the many podcast feeds where you can get us. We appreciate it. We'll catch you next time here on the Go 24/7 podcast.